The ship fell from the sky like a wounded bird, trailing smoke and fire across the night. The humans who saw it thought it was a sign from the gods, a burning star sent to deliver a message. But it was no star, and it carried no divine message. It carried the last survivors of a dying race. The Velith were insectoid beings with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light like gemstones. And they had been running for 300 years, fleeing from one star system to another, always one step ahead of the hunters who sought to destroy them. Their crime was simple. They had refused to submit. The Dominion hegemony ruled over 2,000 star systems, and they demanded absolute obedience from every species they encountered. But the Velith had said no, and for that single word they had been hunted to the edge of extinction. Now only 47 of them remained, huddled inside a damaged ship that crashed into a muddy riverbank on a small blue planet that had no name in any galactic database. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, primitive beings who had only recently discovered how to work bronze and build simple cities. The Velith elder named Kethris pulled herself from the wreckage and looked up at the night sky, knowing that the hegemony would find them eventually, knowing that her people had perhaps a few decades before the hunters arrived. She looked at the primitive village in the distance, at the fires burning and the simple mud homes, and she made a decision that would echo through history. We will help them, she said to her fellow survivors. The other Velith were confused, asking why they would waste their remaining years helping creatures who could not even travel to their own moon. Creatures who would never be able to repay them or even understand what they had lost. Kethris answered simply, because we can, and because kindness needs no reason. And so began the secret work of the Velith. They did not reveal themselves to humanity, for they knew that primitive species often reacted with fear and violence to things they did not understand. So instead, they worked quietly in the shadows. They left tools where humans would find them. Better designs for plows and wheels and irrigation channels. They whispered knowledge into the dreams of sleeping scholars, teaching them mathematics and astronomy and medicine. When plagues struck human settlements, the Velith secretly treated water supplies and left herbs that would cure the sick. When wars threatened to destroy promising civilizations, the Velith quietly sabotaged weapons and created circumstances that led to peace for 3 generations. They worked, asking nothing, taking nothing, simply giving because giving was all they had left. The humans never knew their benefactors existed. They simply believed they were blessed by fortune or watched over by kind spirits. And in a way, they were right. Kethris grew old during this time, her carapace turning gray and brittle. But she never stopped working, never stopped giving. She taught a young human farmer how to rotate crops through dreams that he thought were visions from the gods. She guided a lost child home through a forest by leaving a trail of glowing stones. She healed a dying mother so that her children would not grow up alone. Small kindnesses, countless kindnesses, kindnesses that cost the Velith nothing but time and effort. And then the hunters came. The hegemony warship entered the solar system without warning, its sensors sweeping across the primitive planets until they found the faint energy signature of the crashed Velith vessel. Commander Vrix of the hegemony Third Fleet looked at the scan results and felt only boredom. For this was routine work, a simple task of finishing off a species that should have submitted centuries ago. He dispatched a landing party to the blue planet with orders to execute any survivors and destroy all evidence of their presence. The soldiers found the Velith camp hidden in a valley, and they found the old and the young and the sick, none of whom offered any resistance. Kethris was the last to be brought before Commander Vrix, and she did not beg or plead or ask for mercy. Instead, she asked one question: "Will you harm the natives of this world?" Vrix laughed at the question, asking why he would waste resources on primitive creatures who had not even achieved basic spaceflight. saying that they were beneath the hegemony's notice. Not even worth enslaving, Kethris felt relief wash through her old bones. For at least her work would survive. At least the humans would live on. She made one final request, asking for permission to leave a message for the natives. A simple recording that they might find someday. And Vrix agreed because it amused him to watch a dying species waste its last moments on sentiment. Kethris worked through the night, recording her message in every human language she had learned over the decades, encoding star charts and basic scientific principles into a crystal that would survive for millennia. When she finished, she walked out to meet her executioners with her head held high. The last words she spoke were not for her killers, but for the humans she would never meet. Remember us kindly, little ones, and know that you were loved by strangers from the stars. The hegemony soldiers carried out their orders with mechanical efficiency. They burned the Velith camp and scattered the ashes. They deleted the planet's coordinates from their navigation computers because it was standard protocol. For worlds beneath notice, they left without ever realizing what they had done, without understanding that they had just planted the seeds of their own destruction. The data crystal lay buried in the mud for 2,000 years above it. Humanity grew and changed and reached for the sky, never knowing that their rapid advancement was not entirely natural, never knowing that strangers had sacrificed everything to give them a chance. But they would learn, and when they learned, they would remember. The Velith had asked only to be remembered kindly. Humanity would do far more than that. Humanity would remember the favor, and the galaxy would feel the consequences. The crystal was found by accident. A young archaeologist named Sarah Chem was digging in a remote valley when her shovel struck something that should not have existed. A perfectly smooth object made of a material that no human laboratory could identify. When she brought it to the surface and cleaned away 2,000 years of dirt, the crystal began to glow. The message played in perfect English, then switched to Mandarin, then Arabic, then 100 other languages, both living and dead. And the world stopped to listen. "We were the Velith," the ancient voice said. "We helped you because we could. And if you ever reach the stars, please remember us kindly." The star charts that followed changed everything humanity thought it knew about the universe. Within a decade, every nation on Earth had united under a single goal, reaching the stars that the Velith had shown them. Within a century, humanity had built its first faster-than-light ship. Within 5 centuries, they had colonized 100 worlds and made contact with dozens of alien species. The galaxy was vast and old and filled with wonders that made humanity feel small. But humans had never been a species that stayed small for long. They learned quickly that the galaxy was also dangerous. The Kreth Collective tried to enslave human colonists and learned that humans would rather die than kneel. And they fought back with such ferocity that the collective retreated and never returned. The merchant lords of Axis Prime tried to cheat human traders and learned that humans had long memories for betrayal. And within a generation, the merchant lords found themselves economically isolated and bankrupt. The Silence Cult tried to destroy human worlds with biological weapons and learned that humans were very creative when it came to revenge. And the cult's homeworld became a dead rock that served as a warning to others. Species across the galaxy began to whisper about the humans, about their strange combination of kindness and cruelty, about how they would give you the shirt off their back if you were a friend but would hunt you across 1,000 light years if you were an enemy. But what puzzled the other species most was the holiday. Every human world, every human ship, every human station celebrated something called Velith Remembrance Day. On this day, humans would gather and tell stories about insectoid aliens who had helped their ancestors long ago. Aliens who had been killed by something called the Dominion Hegemony. Children learned the story in schools. Artists painted images of four-armed beings with compound eyes. Musicians wrote songs about strangers who gave everything and asked for nothing. The original data crystal was placed in a vault on Earth and declared the most sacred object in human civilization, more valuable than any treasure, more protected than any weapon. Other species found this behavior strange. The Velith had died 2,000 years ago. So why did humans still care? Why did they still remember? Why did they still tell the stories? A philosopher from the thinking pools of Mendax wrote a famous essay trying to explain human behavior to the rest of the galaxy. Humans do not forget. He wrote, "This is their gift and their curse. They remember kindness and they remember cruelty. They remember friends and they remember enemies. And time means nothing to their memory. A favor done 1,000 years ago is still a favor owed. A wrong done 1,000 years ago is still a wrong to be answered." He concluded with a warning. Do not make enemies of humans, for their children will hate you, and their children's children will hate you. And 100 generations later, their descendants will still be planning your destruction. The essay was widely read, but not widely believed. Most species thought it was exaggeration. They were wrong. In the classified archives of Terran intelligence, hidden from public view, analysts spent their careers studying one subject: the Dominion hegemony. They mapped hegemony territory using data gathered from traders and refugees. They studied hegemony military tactics using accounts from conquered species. They identified hegemony weaknesses by analyzing every scrap of information. They could find generation after generation of analysts added to the files, building a picture of an enemy that humanity had never met. An enemy that did not even know humanity existed. An enemy that had forgotten a casual cruelty committed 2,000 years ago. The analysts knew that someday the hegemony would expand into human space. They knew that someday there would be contact, and they wanted to be ready. Every war game at the Terran Military Academy included scenarios involving the hegemony. Every strategic simulation assumed the hegemony as the ultimate opponent. Every new weapon system was tested against projected hegemony defenses. Humanity smiled at the galaxy and spoke of peace and cooperation and mutual benefit. Behind that smile, they sharpened knives that had been forged in the fires of a 2,000-year grudge. The Velith had been pacifists who believed in kindness and helping others. Humanity honored their memory in a different way. They would make sure that what happened to the Velith would never happen again. They would make sure that the hegemony paid for what they had done. And when the time came, when the hegemony finally stumbled into human space, expecting to find just another primitive species to conquer, they would discover that some debts cannot be escaped, some favors must be repaid, and some memories never fade. The long climb was almost over. The reckoning was about to begin. The hegemony diplomatic vessel arrived at the edge of Terran space on a bright Tuesday morning, and the galaxy held its breath. Ambassador Krethvos stood on the bridge of his ship and looked at the human defense stations with mild curiosity, thinking that these creatures had built impressive structures for such a young species. The hegemony had ruled 2,000 star systems for 10,000 years, and in that time they had encountered hundreds of species, conquering some, enslaving others, and occasionally trading with those strong enough to be useful. Humans appeared to be in the third category. Krethvos had read the intelligence reports describing a species of moderate military power, aggressive but not unreasonable, potentially valuable as trading partners or buffer states against other rivals. He expected routine negotiations. He expected the humans to be honored by hegemony attention. He expected to return home with a favorable trade agreement and perhaps some new territory ceded by grateful primitives. He was wrong about everything. The human ambassador who met him at the diplomatic station was a woman named Director Wei, small and gray-haired and soft-spoken, and she smiled warmly as she welcomed him to human space. The first 3 days of negotiations went smoothly. The hegemony offered trade routes and technology sharing and mutual defense pacts, and the humans listened politely and asked intelligent questions and seemed genuinely interested in cooperation. Krethvos began to relax, thinking that these humans were more civilized than he had expected, thinking that this mission would be a simple success. On the 4th day, Director Wei asked to speak with him privately. They sat across from each other in a small conference room, and Director Wei poured tea for both of them with hands that were perfectly steady. "Ambassador," she said, "I have one question before we proceed." Krethvos nodded graciously, expecting some minor concern about trade tariffs or border disputes. "Do you remember the Velith?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Krethvos searched his memory for the name, finding only a vague reference to some minor species that had been dealt with centuries ago. Or was it millennia? He could not quite recall. "The Velith," he said slowly. "I believe they were a small civilization that refused integration into the hegemony. They were handled according to standard protocols." "Handled," Director Wei repeated, and her voice was still soft, but something in it had changed. Something that made Krethvos suddenly uncomfortable. "You mean exterminated?" she continued. "Every man and woman and child hunted down and killed because they would not kneel. Their culture erased, their history forgotten, their entire species wiped from existence." Krethvos shifted in his seat, not understanding why this human was so interested in ancient history, not understanding the cold fury building behind her polite smile. "That was thousands of years ago," he said. "Regrettable, perhaps, but hardly relevant to current negotiations." Director Wei set down her teacup with a soft click. "The Velith came to our world," she said, "when we were nothing but primitives playing with bronze tools. They came to us and they helped us. They taught us and healed us and protected us. They gave us everything and asked for nothing in return." She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard as diamonds. "And then your hegemony came and murdered them. Every last one, and you did not even bother to remember their names." Krethvos felt the first stirrings of fear, something he had not experienced in decades, something that ambassadors of the mighty hegemony were not supposed to feel. "We remember," Director Wei said. 2,000 years, and we still remember. We teach our children their names. We honor their sacrifice. We have never forgotten what they did for us or what you did to them." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "The Terran ascendancy formally rejects all hegemony proposals," she said. "Furthermore, we declare the extinction of the Velith to be an act of genocide, and we announce our intention to pursue appropriate remediation." Krethvos stood as well, his diplomatic training finally kicking in past his shock. "You cannot be serious," he said. "The hegemony rules 2,000 systems. You have perhaps 200. You would be destroyed within a year." Director Wei turned back to him and smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had been waiting their entire life for this moment. "Perhaps," she said, "but we are human, Ambassador. And we have been preparing for this war since before your great-grandfather was born." Krethvos left human space that same day, carrying a formal declaration of hostile intent back to the Hegemony High Council. The council laughed when they heard the news, a species they had never encountered, threatening revenge for something that happened 2,000 years ago. It was absurd. It was amusing. It was clearly a bluff. They sent a small fleet to teach the humans a lesson in respect. The fleet never returned. 3 days later, 17 hegemony military installations across their frontier exploded simultaneously, destroyed by weapons that had been smuggled into position over decades of patient preparation. The High Council stopped laughing. They looked at the damage reports and the casualty figures, and the evidence of long-term infiltration, and they realized with growing horror that they had made a terrible mistake. They had forgotten the Velith, but humanity had not, and now the consequences were coming for them all. The war burned across 1,000 light years. Admiral Maya Santa stood on the bridge of the battleship Remembrance and watched another hegemony station die, its hull cracking open like an egg as human missiles tore through its defenses. She should have felt satisfaction, but instead she felt only exhaustion. For this war had already cost her more than she could bear to count. Her son David had died 3 months ago at the Battle of Crix Nebula, his ship destroyed by hegemony plasma fire while covering the retreat of civilian transports. She had not cried when she received the news because admirals were not allowed to cry. But something inside her had gone cold and hard, and she wondered sometimes if it would ever warm again. The war was going well by military standards. Human tactics were devastating the hegemony. Strategies that had been refined over 2,000 years of simulation and planning. Weapons that had been designed specifically to counter hegemony technology. But wars are not won by tactics alone. Maya thought about the Velith often now, wondering what they would think if they could see what their kindness had created. They had been pacifists who believed that violence was never the answer, who had helped humanity out of pure compassion, who had died without raising a hand against their killers. Would they be proud of humanity now, or would they be horrified? On the other side of the front lines, a hegemony soldier named Crixtel huddled in a trench on a world whose name he had already forgotten. He had joined the military because his family had served the hegemony for generations, because it was expected, because he had believed that the hegemony brought order and civilization to a chaotic galaxy. Now he was not so sure. The humans fought like nothing he had ever seen, with a fury that seemed personal, with a hatred that burned hotter than plasma. He had captured a human soldier last week, and before the prisoner died from his wounds, he had spoken to Crixtel, telling him about the Velith, about what the hegemony had done, about why humanity would never stop fighting. "You killed them," the human had said. "They helped us, and you killed them, and you did not even remember. You forgot them like they were nothing." Crixtel had looked up the Velith in the military database afterward and found almost nothing. Just a brief note about a minor species eliminated during routine expansion operations, eliminated as if they had been insects instead of people. He began to ask questions after that, questions that made his superiors uncomfortable. Questions about how many species the hegemony had eliminated, how many cultures they had erased, how many peoples they had forgotten. The answers were worse than he had imagined. Far across the galaxy, a neutral diplomat named Thessaly worked desperately to broker peace, shuttling between human and hegemony representatives, trying to find some common ground that could end the killing. She came from a species called the Mediators, evolved specifically for conflict resolution, and she had never failed to find a peaceful solution until now. The humans were polite to her, respectful even. But they would not bend. "We will accept nothing less than full acknowledgement of the Velith genocide," Director Wei told her. "We will accept nothing less than reparations paid to every species the hegemony has wronged. We will accept nothing less than fundamental reform of hegemony governance. That would mean the end of the hegemony as it exists." Thessaly said. "Yes," Director Wei agreed. "It would. The hegemony was no more flexible. We will not apologize for maintaining order," the High Council declared. "We will not pay tribute to primitives. We will not change our ways because of ancient history." Thessaly watched the death toll climb and wondered if she was witnessing the birth of something new or simply the destruction of everything old. The turning point came not from military victory, but from something far more powerful. The message spread through hegemony, space like wildfire, passed from slave to slave, from conquered world to conquered world, from every species that had ever suffered under hegemony rule. They remembered, the message said. The humans remembered a species that helped them 2,000 years ago. They remembered, and they came back. They are fighting for people they never met, dying for a debt they never owed. Hope is the most dangerous weapon in the universe on 100 worlds. Slaves began to resist on 1,000 stations. Conquered peoples began to sabotage. The hegemony had ruled through fear for 10,000 years. But fear only works when people believe they have no choice. Now they had a choice. Now they had an example. A species called the Keth were the first to openly revolt, overwhelming their hegemony overseers and declaring independence. The hollow folk followed. Then the singers of distant suns. Then the iron children of Krath. The hegemony found itself fighting a war on two fronts. Against human forces from outside and rebellion from within. Admiral Santos received reports of the uprisings and felt something crack inside her cold, hard heart. This was why they were fighting, not for revenge, not for hatred, not even for the Velith themselves. They were fighting so that what happened to the Velith would never happen again. She thought about David and wondered if he would have understood. She thought about Kethris, the Velith elder who had given everything to help a primitive species she would never meet. She thought about kindness and cruelty and the strange ways they echoed through history. The weight of memory was heavy, but it was also powerful, and humanity would carry it all the way to the end. The Dominion hegemony fell not with a bang, but with a slow grinding collapse. Like a mountain crumbling into the sea, human forces pushed deep into their core systems while rebellions tore apart their conquered territories. And within 5 years, the empire that had ruled for 10,000 years simply ceased to exist. The High Council fled to a remote system and sued for peace, offering everything humanity had demanded and more, begging for mercy from a species they had once dismissed as primitives. Humanity could have taken everything. They could have become the new hegemony, ruling over the shattered remains of a fallen empire. Taking slaves and territory and tribute, Director Wei stood before the Terran Assembly and made the argument against revenge. We did not fight this war to become what we destroyed, she said. We fought because the Velith deserved to be remembered, because kindness should not be repaid with extinction, because the galaxy should know that some things are sacred. She paused and looked at the representatives from 100 human worlds. The Velith were pacifists. She continued. They believed that helping others was its own reward. That violence was never the answer. That compassion was stronger than cruelty. We cannot honor their memory by becoming the monsters who killed them. The assembly debated for 3 days. In the end, they chose mercy. The hegemony leadership was arrested and tried for crimes against sapient life. Some were executed for the worst atrocities. Others were imprisoned, but most were simply stripped of power and allowed to live out their lives in obscurity. The conquered species were freed and given assistance to rebuild their civilizations. The hegemony military was disbanded and its weapons were destroyed. And humanity created something new. They called it the Velith Accords, a framework for galactic civilization built on principles that the Velith would have recognized. Genocide was declared a crime against all sapient life, punishable by collective intervention from all signatory species. Slavery was abolished across all Accord territories. Emerging species were to be protected and guided, never exploited or conquered. Every species that signed the Accords agreed to remember what had been lost, to preserve the histories of extinct peoples, to ensure that no civilization would ever again be erased and forgotten on the hegemony throne world. Now renamed Memorial, humanity built a monument. It was a tower that reached toward the sky, covered in names and dates and histories, a record of every species the hegemony had ever exterminated. The Velith were listed first, their story carved in stone at the base of the tower, their image rendered in precious metals and glowing crystals. Visitors came from across the galaxy to see it. They came to mourn and to remember and to swear that nothing like this would ever happen again. Years passed and the galaxy settled into a new order, one built on cooperation rather than conquest, on memory rather than forgetting. And then the delegation arrived at Earth. They came from a dozen species that humanity had never encountered. Peoples from the far reaches of the galaxy who had heard stories about the war and the Accords and the strange species that had changed everything. Their leader was an elderly being with silver skin and too many eyes, and she requested an audience with the human president to ask one question. President Chun received them in the same room where Director Wei had first confronted the hegemony ambassador, and she poured tea for her guests, just as Wei had done all those years ago. "We have traveled far to meet you," the silver being said. "We have heard the stories, but we needed to know if they were true." "What stories?" President Chun asked. "That you went to war over a species you never met. That you sacrificed millions of lives for a people who died before your civilization existed. That you reshaped the galaxy because of a kindness done 2,000 years ago." President Chun sipped her tea and considered the question. "The stories are true," she said. "But why?" The silver being pressed. "The Velith could not repay you, could not thank you, could not even know what you did in their name. Why would you sacrifice so much for people who could never give you anything in return?" President Chun set down her cup and smiled. "Because that is not why you help others," she said. "You do not help people because they can repay you. You help them because it is right, because kindness matters, because the universe is cold and dark, and the only warmth we have is what we give each other." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the blue sky of Earth. "The Velith helped us when we were nothing," she said. "They asked for nothing in return. They simply gave because they could. And when they died, they asked only to be remembered kindly." She turned back to face her guests. "We could not save them," she said. "But we could remember them. We could honor what they did. We could make sure that their kindness was not wasted." Her voice hardened slightly. "And we could make sure that the galaxy knows. Humanity always pays its debts. We remember our friends and we remember our enemies. And time means nothing to us when it comes to either." The silver being was quiet for a long moment. "Your species frightens me," she said at last. "Your capacity for loyalty and for vengeance. Your long memory and your terrible patience." President Chen nodded, accepting the words without offense. "But," the silver being continued, "you also give me hope, for if there is a species in the galaxy that will remember kindness forever, perhaps kindness is worth giving after all." She rose and bowed in the formal manner of her people. "We would like to sign the Velith Accords," she said. "We would like to join your alliance of memory." President Chun bowed in return. "Welcome," she said, "and know that from this day forward, humanity will remember you too. Far away on Memorial, at the base of the great tower." The wind blew gently across the carved stone that bore the image of Catharis, the Velith elder who had given everything to help a primitive species she would never meet. The inscription below her image read, "She helped us because she could, and we will remember her forever." The galaxy had felt the consequences, but it had also learned the lesson. Kindness matters, memory endures, and some debts are never forgotten.